think I'll stand, if you don't mind. Thank you so much, and thank you to the folks at Books Inc. and the Palo Alto Library for this wonderful evening. You're lucky to have two wonderful institutions here. So the Good Girls Revolt. It began on March 16th, 1970, when 46 of us who worked at Newsweek sued the magazine for gender discrimination in hiring and promotion. We were protesting a system in which virtually all of the writers were men and all of the women were researchers or fact-checkers. It was a system that Henry Luce had devised when he created Time magazine in 1929. He separated the editorial functions of the news magazine. At a newspaper, a reporter goes out, reports the story, comes back, writes the story, and is responsible for the accuracy of the story. And Henry Luce separated those functions in which the reporters in the field reported a story, sent files to a writer in New York who wrote the story, and then the story was fact-checked. And only women were hired as fact-checkers, and all the reporters and writers were men. So when Newsweek started in 1933, they simply copied the Time format. If you applied to Newsweek and wanted to be a writer, you were simply told that women do not write at Newsweek. If you want to write, go somewhere else. And in fact, that's what a lot of women did. Women who knew they wanted to be journalists or had been working on their college papers, women like Nora Ephron, Jane Bryan Quinn, Ellen Goodman, Susan Brown Miller, all came to Newsweek as researchers, realized they were never going to be promoted to writer, and then left fairly quickly to have very successful careers afterwards. But we were the good girls. So we were highly educated, mostly white, middle-class girls who were told in college that we were very smart, we were very competent, but the word career in the 60s was hardly ever mentioned. Some women went on to maybe medical school or law school, but most women were expected to have a job until they got married and have children. And so we came to Newsweek thinking that this was a fabulous, and it was a very glamorous job to have in those days. We started as, actually, women were hired on the mail desk to deliver the mail. Then you graduated to Clipper, where you clipped newspapers and delivered them to the writers. And then if you were really good, you got to be a researcher. And that was a really exciting job because, in fact, you worked on the stories of the week that were breaking news. You worked with writers, you worked with reporters, you worked with the editors. And those of us who worked in the sections in the back of the magazine, from medicine or the arts or lifestyle or religion, did a lot of reporting, as did the women in the business section, because New York was the financial capital of the world. And so we got to do reporting in addition to the fact-checking. And it was a very collegial place. We were good friends with the writers and the reporters. It was a patriarchal place. It was run by men, and the man at the top, Osborne Elliott, had this interest. We were all on first names, so we called him Oz. Sort of had the veneer of being equal, even though we weren't. But it felt very sort of collegial. And of course, in the mid-60s when I got there, the sex revolution was happening. And there was a lot of sex at Newsweek, most of it consensual. Sometimes, however, there was sexual harassment and there was a lot of behavior that crossed the line. But it was a great job to have. So in the late 60s, around 68, 69, the women's movement was starting to gain steam. And we were reading about it. Some of the women were actually in consciousness-raising groups. I was beginning to cover meetings of radical women. The Red Stockings group would only talk to women reporters, and so I was reporting on them. And we suddenly began to realize that this didn't just apply to those women. It also applied to us. And our revolt began when one of our researcher friends, a woman named Judy Gingold, who was a Marshall scholar, and came back to New York and could not find a job and ended up as a fact-checker in Newsweek, was having a conversation one day with a friend of hers who was a lawyer. And so the woman said, "Tell me about Newsweek," and Judy told her about our jobs. And the woman said, "You know, that's illegal. And Judy said, it is? And she said, yes, you cannot segregate jobs by gender. The 1964 Civil Rights Act outlawed it. Judy was absolutely flabbergasted. The woman said, call the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission in Washington and find out. So the next day, she dialed the EEOC in Washington, and the woman said, yes, that's illegal. And Judy said, well, you know, I don't think the men know it's illegal. She said, you know, why don't we just tell them? And the woman said, are you crazy? She said, people in power don't want to give up power. They'll promote 2 women, they'll co-opt your movement, and that will be the end of it. She said, you have a very clear case. You have to sue. So now Judy had a moral issue. It wasn't just she wasn't being promoted. This was an illegal thing. And one by one, she started talking to her friends. I was the 5th person that she spoke to. And we decided, because we were terrified that we would be fired if anybody found out, that each of us would talk to one other person who would then talk to one other person. And where did we organize? In the ladies' room. That place of tears and organization. And so we, one by one, got to be about 20 women on the staff when we realized we needed a lawyer to figure out what we were going to do. Unfortunately, the only women who didn't join us at the time were the black researchers. There were about 4 or 5 women at the time who were researchers, and we went to them and asked them to join. And they were really torn. I mean, their loyalty was to the civil rights movement. They felt at the time, this is the late 60s, more discriminated against as blacks than they did as women. And they also felt that, you know, we very privileged, middle-class white women didn't exactly have the same goals as they did. We were worried about our careers and getting ahead. They were worried about that, but they had to work. They were worried about much larger issues within the black community, about their families and about what was going on with racism. And so they decided not to join us, which we were very sorry about, because they were all terrific women. And later they told me, several of them when I interviewed them, that they realized later how much, being a woman, they were discriminated against as well. But at that moment in time, it was a very heady moment for the civil rights movement. So we went looking for a woman lawyer. We wanted a woman, of course, and most of the women lawyers were in trusts and estates. And so we decided this was a civil rights case and we should go to the ACLU. And there we found the assistant legal director of the ACLU was a woman named Eleanor Holmes Norton, now the representative from the District of Columbia. Eleanor is as fiery and passionate now as she was then. She was 7 months pregnant. She had an afro out to here. And we went to visit her in her office, and 4 of us, I remember, and we were explaining how the system worked at Newsweek, and she grabbed the magazine out of our hands, and she opened it to the masthead, and she said, well, the fact that there are men from the top category to the next to the last category, and the fact that there are only women in this last category means that there's a pattern of discrimination. So I'm going to take this case. And she was great. So all this was happening the beginning of 1970, when Newsweek decided that the women's movement was becoming very newsworthy, and they would do a cover story on Women's Lib, as it was then called. There was one problem. They didn't have a woman to write it. They knew they couldn't have a man write it. I actually had been promoted as a junior writer 6 months earlier to write fashion and other features by my boss, who was a great mentor. But I was not really experienced enough to write a cover. And so for the first time in Newsweek's history, they went outside and they hired a star writer at the New York Post, Helen Dudar, to come and freelance the piece for Newsweek. So being good journalists, we knew we had a great news peg. So the Monday that Newsweek came out on the newsstands with a cover on the women's movement called Women in Revolt, 46 of us announced we were suing the magazine for sex discrimination. As you can imagine, it was delicious timing, and all the news organizations covered us, not only in New York, but in London and in Italy and all over the world. My favorite headline was the Daily News's headline was, "News Hens Sue Newsweek." And then the first line was 46 women